Queen of Knives. The reappearance of the lady is a matter of individual taste. Will Goldston, Tricks and Illusions. When I was a boy, from time to time, I stayed with my grandparents. Old people. I knew they were old. Chocolates in their house remained uneaten until I came to stay. This, then, was aging. My grandfather always made breakfast at sunup, a pot of tea for her and him and me, some toast and marmalade, the silver shred and the gold. Lunch and dinner, those were my grandmother's to make. The kitchen was again her domain. All the pans and spoons, the mincer, all the whisks and knives, her loyal subjects. She would prepare the food with them, singing her little songs. Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer due. Or sometimes, you made me love you. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do it. She had no voice, not one to speak of. Business was very slow. My grandfather spent his days at the top of the house, in his tiny dark room where I was not permitted to go, bringing out paper faces from the darkness, the cheerless smiles of other people's holidays. My grandmother would take me for gray walks along the promenade. Mostly I would explore the small, wet, grassy space behind the house, the blackberry brambles and the garden shed. It was a hard week for my grandparents, forced to entertain a wide-eyed boy child. So, one night they took me to the King's Theater. The King's. Variety. The lights went down, red curtains rose. A popular comedian of the day came on, stammered out his name, his catchphrase, pulled out a sheet of glass and stood half behind it, raising the arm and leg that we could see reflected. He seemed to fly. It was his trademark. So we all laughed and cheered. He told a joke or two, quite badly. His haplessness, his awkwardness, these were what we had come to see. Bemused and balding and bespectacled, he reminded me a little of my grandfather. And then the comedian was done. Some ladies danced all legs across the stage. A singer sang a song I didn't know. The audience were old people, like my grandparents, tired and retired, all of them laughing and applauding. In the interval, my grandfather queued for a chalk ice and a couple of tubs. We ate our ices as the lights went down. The safety curtain rose, and then the real curtain. The ladies danced across the stage again, and then the thunder rolled. The smoke went puff. A conjurer appeared and bowed, clapped. The ladies walked on, smiling from the wings, glittered, shimmered, smiled. We looked at her, and in that moment flowers grew, and silks and pennants tumbled from his fingertips. The flags of all nations, said my grandfather, nudging me. They were up his sleeve. Since he was a young man, I could not imagine him as a child. My grandfather had been, by his own admission, one of the people who knew how things worked. He had built his own television, my grandmother told me, when they were first married. It was enormous, though the screen was small. This was in the days before television programs. They watched it, though, unsure whether it was people or ghosts they were seeing. He had a patent, too, for something he invented, but it was never manufactured. Stood for the local council, but he came in third. He could repair a shaver or a wireless, develop your film, or build a house for dolls. The doll's house was my mother's. We still had it at my house, shabby and old. It sat out in the grass, all rained on and forgot. The glitter lady wheeled on a box. The box was tall, grown-up person-sized and black. She opened up the front. They turned it round and banged upon the back. The lady stepped inside, still smiling. The magician closed the door on her. When it was opened, she had gone. He bowed. Mirrors, explained my grandfather. She's really still inside. At a gesture, the box collapsed to matchwood. A trap door, assured my grandfather. Grandma hissed him silence. The magician smiled. His teeth were small and crowded. He walked slowly out into the audience. He pointed to my grandmother. He bowed, a Middle European bow, and invited her to join him on the stage. The other people clapped and cheered. My grandmother demurred. I was so close to the magician that I could smell his aftershave, and whispered, "Me, oh my." But still he reached his long fingers for my grandmother. "Pearl, go on up," said my grandfather. "Go with the man." My grandmother must have been, 60 then? She had just stopped smoking, was trying to lose some weight. She was proudest of her teeth, which, though tobacco-stained, were all her own. My grandfather had lost his as a youth riding his bicycle. He had the bright idea to hold on to a bus to pick up speed. The bus had turned, and Grandpa kissed the road. She chewed hard licorice, watching TV at night, or sucked hard caramels, perhaps to make him wrong. She stood up then, a little slowly, put down the paper tub half full of ice cream. The little wooden spoon went down the aisle and up the steps and on the stage. The conjurer applauded her once more. A good sport, that was what she was, a sport. Another glittering woman came from the wings, bringing another box. This one was red. "That's her," nodded my grandfather. "The one who vanished off before. You see, that's her." Perhaps it was. All I could see was a woman who sparkled standing next to my grandmother, who fiddled with her pearls and looked embarrassed. The lady smiled and faced us, then she froze, a statue or a window mannequin. The magician pulled the box, with ease, down to the front of stage where my grandmother waited. A moment or so of chit-chat, where she was from, her name, that kind of thing. "They'd never met before?" She shook her head. The magician opened the door. My grandmother stepped in. "Perhaps it's not the same one," admitted my grandfather on reflection. I think she had darker hair, the other girl." I didn't know. I was proud of my grandmother, but also embarrassed, hoping she'd do nothing to make me squirm, that she wouldn't sing one of her songs. She walked into the box. They shut the door. He opened a compartment at the top, a little door. We saw my grandmother's face. "Pearl, are you all right, Pearl?" My grandmother smiled and nodded. The magician closed the door. The lady gave him a long, thin case, so he opened it, took out a sword, and rammed it through the box. And then another, and another, and my grandfather chuckled and explained, "The blade slides in the hilt, and then a fake slides out the other side." Then he produced a sheet of metal, which he slid into the box half the way up. It cut the thing in half. The two of them, the woman and the man, lifted the top half of the box up and off and put it on the stage with half my grandma in. The top half. He opened up the little door again. For a moment, my grandmother's face beamed at us, trustingly. When he closed the door before, she went down. When he closed the door before, she went down a trap door, and now she's standing halfway up, my grandfather confided. "She'll tell us how it's done when it's all over." I wanted him to stop talking. I needed magic. 2 knives now, through the half a box, at neck height. Are you there, Pearl? Asked the magician. Let us know. Do you know any songs? My grandmother sang Daisy, Daisy. He picked up the part of the box with the little door in it, the head part, and he walked about, and she sang Daisy, Daisy, first at one side of the stage, then at the other. That's him, said my grandfather, and he's throwing his voice. It sounds like Grandma, I said. Of course it does, he said. Of course it does. He's good, he said. He's good. He's very good. The conjurer opened up the box again, now hat box sized. My grandmother had finished Daisy, Daisy, and was on a song which went, my, here we go. The driver's drunk and the horse won't go. Now we're going back. Now we're going back, 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 back to London town. She had been born in London, told me ominous tales from time to time of her childhood, of the children who ran into her father's shop, shouting, shonky, shonky, sheeny, running away. She would not let me wear a black shirt because, she said, she remembered the marches through the East End. Mausley's black shirts. Her sister got an eye blackened. The conjurer took a kitchen knife, pushed it slowly through the red hat box, and then the singing stopped. He put the boxes back together, pulled out the knives and swords one by one by one. He opened the compartment in the top. My grandmother smiled, embarrassed at us displaying her own old teeth. He closed the compartment, hiding her from view, pulled out the last knife, opened the main door again, and she was gone. A gesture, and the red box vanished too. It's up his sleeve, my grandfather explained, but seemed unsure. The conjurer made 2 doves fly from a burning plate, a puff of smoke, and he was gone as well. She'll be under the stage now, or backstage, said my grandfather, having a cup of tea. She'll come back to us with flowers or with chocolates. I hoped for chocolates. The dancing girls again, the comedian for the last time, and all of them came on together at the end. The grand finale, said my grandfather. Look sharp, perhaps you'll be back on now. But no, they sang, when you're riding along on the crest of the wave and the sun is in the sky. The curtain went down and we shuffled out into the lobby. We loitered for a while. Then we went down to the stage door and waited for my grandmother to come out. The conjurer came out in street clothes. The glitter woman looked so different in a mac. My grandfather went to speak to him. He shrugged, told us he spoke no English, and produced a half a crown from behind my ear and vanished off into the dark and rain. Never saw my grandmother again. We went back to their house and carried on. My grandfather now had to cook for us. And so for breakfast, dinner, lunch, and tea, we had golden toast and silver marmalade and cups of tea till I went home. He got so old after that night, as if the years took him all in a rush. Daisy, Daisy, he'd sing, give me your answer, do. If you were the only girl in the world, and I were the only boy. My old man said, follow the van. My grandfather had the voice in the family. They said he could have been a cantor, but there were snapshots to develop, radios and razors to repair. His brothers were a singing duo. The Nightingales had been on television in the early days. He bore it well, although quite late one night I woke, remembering the licorice sticks in the pantry. I walked downstairs. My grandfather stood there in his bare feet, and in the kitchen, all alone, I saw him stab a knife into a box. You made me love you. I didn't want to do it.
That's sad.
The Daughter of Owls.
Uh-oh.
From the Remains of Gentle Smee and Judas Me by John Aubrey, RSS, 1686-87, pages 262-263. I had this story from my friend Edmund Wilde, Esquire, who had it from Mr. Farrington, who said it was old in his time. In the town of Dimpton, a newly born girl was left one night on the steps of the church, where the sexton found her there the next morning, and she had hold of a curious thing, viz., ye pellet of an owl, which when crumbled showed the usual composition of an hoot owl's pellet, thus skin and teeth and small bones. The old wives of the town said as follows, that the girl was the daughter of owls, and that she should be burnt to death, for she was not born of woman. Notwithstanding, wiser heads and greybeards prevailed, and the babe was taken to the convent. For this was shortly after the Papish times, and the convent had been left empty, for the townfolk thought it was a place of devils and such, and hoot owls and screech owls, and many bats did make their homes in the tower. And there she was left, and one of the wives of the town each day went to the convent and fed the babe, etc. It was prognosticated that ye babe would die, which she did not do. Instead, she grew year on and about until she was a maid of 14 summers. She was the prettiest thing you ever did see, a fine young lass who spent her days and nights behind high stone walls with no one never to see, but a town wife who came every morn. One market day, the good wife talked too loudly of the girl's prettiness, and also that she could not speak, or she had never learned the manner of it. The men of Dimpton, the greybeards, and the young men spoke together, saying, if we were there to visit her, who would know? Meaning by visit, that they did intend to ravish her. It was put about thus, that ye menfolk would go a-hunting all in a company, when the moon would be full, which it being, they crept one by one from their houses, and met outside the convent, and the reeve of Dimpton unlocked the gate, and one by one they went in. They found her hiding in the cellar, being startled by a noise. The maid was more pretty even than they had heard. Her hair was red, which was uncommon, and she wore but a white shift. And when she saw them, she was much afraid, for she had never seen no men before, save only the women who brought her victuals. And she stared at them with huge eyes, and she uttered small cries, as if she were imploring them not to hurt her. The townfolk merely laughed, for they meant mischief, and were wicked, cruel men, and they came at her in the moon's light. Then the girl began screeching and wailing, but that did not stay them from their purpose, and the great window went dark, and the light of the moon was blocked, and there was the sound of mighty wings, but the men did not see it, as they were intent on their ravishment. The folk of Dimpton in their beds that night dreamed of hoots and screeches and howls, and of great birds, and they dreamed that they were become little mice and rats. On the morrow, when the sun was high, the good wives of the town went through Dimpton a-hunting high and low for their husbands and their sons, which coming to the convent, They found on the cellar stones ye pellets of owls, and in the pellets they discovered hair and buckles and coins and small bones, and also a quantity of straw upon the floor. And the men of Dympton was none of them seen again. However, for some years thereafter, some said they saw ye made in high places, like the highest oak trees and steeples, etc., this being always in the dusk and at night, and no one could rightly swear if it were her or no. She was a white figure, but Mr. E. Wilde could not remember him rightly whether folks said that she wore clothes or was naked. The truth of it I know not, but it is a merry tale, and one which I write down here. Shoggoth's Old Peculiar. Benjamin Lassiter was coming to the unavoidable conclusion that the woman who had written a walking tour of the British coastline, the book he was carrying in his backpack, had never been on a walking tour of any kind, and would probably not recognize the British coastline if it were to dance through her bedroom at the head of a marching band singing "I'm the British Coastline" in a loud and cheerful voice while accompanying itself on the kazoo. He had been following her advice for 5 days now and had little to show for it except blisters and a backache. All British seaside resorts contain a number of bed and breakfast establishments who will be only too delighted to put you up in the off-season, was one such piece of advice. Ben had crossed it out and written in the margin beside it. All British seaside resorts contain a handful of bed and breakfast establishments, the owners of which take off to Spain or Provence or somewhere on the last day of September, locking the doors behind them as they go. He had added a number of other marginal notes too, such as, do not repeat under any circumstances, order fried eggs again in any roadside cafe. And what is it with the fish and chips thing? And no, they are not. That last one was written beside a paragraph which claimed that if there was one thing that the inhabitants of scenic villages on the British coastline were pleased to see, it was a young American tourist on a walking tour. For 5 hellish days, Ben had walked from village to village, had drunk sweet tea and instant coffee in cafeterias and cafes, and stared out at gray rocky vistas and at the slate-colored sea, shivered under his too thick sweaters, got wet, and failed to see any of the sights that were promised. Sitting in the bus shelter in which he had unrolled his sleeping bag one night, he had begun to translate key descriptive words. Charming, he decided, meant nondescript. Scenic meant ugly, but with a nice view if the rain ever lets up. Delightful probably meant we've never been here and don't know anyone who has. He had also come to the conclusion that the more exotic the name of the village, the duller the village. Thus it was that Ben Lassiter came on the 5th day, somewhere north of Bootle, to the village of Innsmouth, which was rated neither charming, scenic, nor delightful in his guidebook. There were no descriptions of the rusting pier, nor the mounds of rotting lobster pots upon the pebbly beach. On the seafront were 3 bed and breakfasts next to each other, Seaview, Mon Repos, and Shub Niggurath, each with a neon vacancy sign turned off in the window of the front parlor, each with a closed for the season notice thumbtacked on the front door. There were no cafes open on the seafront. The lone fish and chip shop had a closed sign up. Ben waited outside for it to open as the gray afternoon light faded into dusk. Finally, A small, slightly frog-faced woman came down the road, and she unlocked the door of the shop. Ben asked her when they would be open for business, and she looked at him, puzzled, and said, "It's Monday, dear. We'll never open on Monday." Then she went into the fish and chip shop and locked the door behind her, leaving Ben cold and hungry on her doorstep. Ben had been raised in a dry town in northern Texas. The only water was in backyard swimming pools, and the only way to travel was in an air-conditioned pickup truck. So the idea of walking by the sea in a country where they spoke English of a sort had appealed to him. Ben's hometown was double dry. It prided itself on having banned alcohol 30 years before the rest of America leapt onto the prohibition bandwagon, and on never having got off again. Thus, all Ben knew of pubs was that they were sinful places, like bars, only with cuter names. The author of A Walking Tour of the British Coastline had, however, suggested that pubs were good places to go find local color and local information, that one should always stand one's round, and that some of them sold food. The Innsmouth pub was called the Book of Dead Names, and the sign over the door informed Ben that the proprietor was Juan A. Alhazred, licensed to sell wines and spirits. Ben wondered if this meant that they would serve Indian food, which he had eaten on his arrival in Bootle and rather enjoyed. He paused at the signs directing him to the public bar or the saloon bar, wondering if British public bars were private like their public schools, and eventually, because it sounded more like something you would find in a Western, going into the saloon bar. The saloon bar was almost empty. It smelled like last week's spilled beer and the day before yesterday's cigarette smoke. Behind the bar was a plump woman with bottle blonde hair. Sitting in one corner were a couple of gentlemen wearing long gray raincoats and scarves. They were playing dominoes and sipping dark brown, foam-topped beerish drinks from dimpled glass tankards. Ben walked over to the bar. "Do you sell food here?" The barmaid scratched the side of her nose for a moment, then admitted grudgingly that she could probably do him a plowman's. Ben had no idea what this meant, and found himself, for the 100th time, wishing that A Walking Tour of the British Coastline had an American English phrase book in the back. "Is that food?" he asked. She nodded. "Okay, I'll have one of those." "And to drink?" "Coke, please." "We haven't got any Coke." "Pepsi, then." "No Pepsi." "Well, what do you have? Sprite? 7-Up? Gatorade?" She looked blanker than previously. Then she said, "I think there's a bottle or two of Cherry-Aid in the back." "That'll be fine." "It'll be £5 and 20p, and I'll bring you over your ploughman's when it's ready." Ben decided, as he sat at a small and slightly sticky wooden table, drinking something fizzy that both looked and tasted a bright chemical red, that a ploughman's was probably a steak of some kind. He reached this conclusion, colored, he knew by wishful thinking, from imagining rustic, possibly even bucolic ploughmen leading their plump oxen through fresh plowed fields at sunset, and because he could, by then, with equanimity and only a little help from others, have eaten an entire ox. "Here you go, ploughman's," said the barmaid, putting a plate down in front of him. That a ploughman's turned out to be a rectangular slab of sharp-tasting cheese, a lettuce leaf, an undersized tomato with a thumbprint on it, a mound of something wet and brown that tasted like sour jam, and a small, hard, stale roll came as a sad disappointment to Ben, who had already decided that the British treated food as some kind of punishment. He chewed the cheese and the lettuce leaf, and cursed every ploughman in England for choosing to dine upon such swill. The gentlemen in grey raincoats, who had been sitting in the corner, finished their game of dominoes, picked up their drinks, and came and sat beside Ben. "What are you drinking?" one of them asked curiously. "It's called Cherryade," he told them. "It tastes like something from a chemical factory." "Interesting you should say that," said the shorter of the two. "Interesting you should say that, because I had a friend worked in a chemical factory, and he never drank Cherryade." He paused dramatically, and then took a sip of his brown drink. Ben waited for him to go on, but that appeared to be that. The conversation had stopped. In an effort to appear polite, Ben asked in his turn, "So, what are you guys drinking?" The taller of the two strangers, who had been looking lugubrious, brightened up. "Why, that's exceedingly kind of you. Pint of Shoggoth's Old Peculiar for me, please." "And for me too," said his friend. "I can murder a Shoggoth. Here, I bet that would make a good advertising slogan. I could murder a Shoggoth. Oh, I should write to them and suggest it. I bet they'd be very glad of me suggesting it." Ben went over to the barmaid, planning to ask her for 2 pints of Shoggoth's Old Peculiar and a glass of water for himself, only to find that she had already poured 3 pints of the dark beer. Well, he thought, might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb, and he was certain it couldn't be worse than the Cherryade. He took a sip. The beer had the kind of flavor which he suspected advertisers would describe as full-bodied, although if pressed, they would have to admit that the body in question had been that of a goat. He paid the barmaid and maneuvered his way back to his new friends. "So, what you doing in Innsmouth?" asked the taller of the two. "I suppose you're one of our American cousins, come to see the most famous of English villages." "They named the one in America after this one, you know," said the smaller one. "Is there an Innsmouth in the States?" asked Ben. "Oh, I should say so," said the smaller man. "He wrote about it all the time. Him whose name we don't mention." "I'm sorry," said Ben. The little man looked over his shoulder. Then he hissed very loudly, "H.P. Lovecraft." "I told you not to mention that name," said his friend, and he took a sip of the dark brown beer. "H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. bloody Lovecraft. H. bloody P. bloody Love bloody Craft." He stopped to take a breath. What did he know, eh? I mean, what did he bloody know? Ben sipped his beer. The name was vaguely familiar. He remembered it from rummaging through the pile of old-style vinyl LPs in the back of his father's garage. Weren't they a rock group? Wasn't talking about any rock group. I mean the writer. Ben shrugged. I've never heard of him, he admitted. I really mostly only read westerns and technical manuals. The little man nudged his neighbor. Here, Wilf, you hear that? He's never heard of him. Well, there's no harm in that. I used to read that Zane Grey, said the taller. Yes, well, that's nothing to be proud of. This bloke, what did you say your name was? Ben Lassiter. And you are? The little man smiled. He looked awfully like a frog, thought Ben.
I'm Seth, he said, and my friend here is called Wilf.
Charmed, said Wilf.
Ha, said Ben.
Frankly, said the little man,
I agree with ya.
you do, said Ben, perplexed. The little man nodded.
You're H.P. Lovecraft. I don't know what the fuss is about. He couldn't bloody write.
He slurped his stout, then licked the foam from his lips with a long and flexible tongue.
I mean, for starters, you look at them words he used. Eldritch. You know what eldritch means?
Ben shook his head. He seemed to be discussing literature with two strangers in an English pub while drinking beer. He wondered for a moment if he had become someone else while he wasn't looking. The beer tasted less bad the farther down the glass he went, and was beginning to erase the lingering aftertaste of the cherry ache.
Eldritch means weird, peculiar, bloody odd. That's what it means. I looked it up in a dictionary. And gibbous?
Ben shook his head again.
Gibbous means the moon was nearly full. And what about the one he was always calling us, eh? Thing. What's name? Starts with a B. Tip of me tongue.
Bastards, suggested Will.
No, thing. You know. Betrigim. That's it. Means look like frogs.
Hang on, said Will.
I thought they was like a kind of camel.
Seth shook his head vigorously.
So definitely frogs, not camels, frogs.
Wilf slurped his Shoggoths. Ben sipped his carefully, without pleasure. So, said Ben.
They've got two humps,
interjected Wilf, the tall one.
frogs? No, batrachians. Whereas your average dromedary camel, he's only got one. It's for the long journey through the desert. That's what they eat.
Frogs? asked Ben.
Camel humps.
Wilf fixed Ben with one bulging yellow eye.
You listen to me, matey, me lad. After you've been out in some trackless desert for 3 or 4 weeks, a plate of roasted camel hump starts looking particularly tasty.
Seth looked scornful.
You've never eaten a camel hump. I might have done, said Wilf. Yes, but you haven't. You've never even been in a desert. Well, let's say, just supposing I'd been on a pilgrimage to the tomb of Nyarlathotep, the Black King of the Ancients, who shall come in the night from the east, and you shall not know him, you mean? Of course, that's who I mean. Just checking. Stupid question, if you ask me. You could have met someone else with the same name. Well, it's not exactly a common name, is it? Nyarlathotep. That's not exactly going to be two of them, are there? Hello, my name's Nyarlathotep. What a coincidence meeting you here. Funny, them being two of us. I don't exactly think so. Anyway, so I'm trudging through them trackless wastes, thinking to myself, I can murder a camel hump. But you haven't, have you? You've never been out of Innsmouth Harbour. Well, no. There.
Seth looked at Ben triumphantly. Then he leaned over and whispered into Ben's ear.
He gets like this when he gets a few drinks into him, I'm afraid. I heard that, said Wilf. Good, said Seth. Anyway, H.P. Lovecraft, he'd write one of his bloody sentences. The gibbous moon hung low over the eldritch and batrachian inhabitants of squamous Dulwich. What does he mean, eh? What does he mean? I'll tell you what he bloody means. What he bloody means is that the moon was nearly full, and everybody that lived in Dulwich was bloody peculiar frogs. That's what he means. What about the other thing you said? asked Will. What? Squamous. What's that mean then? Seth shrugged. Haven't a clue, he admitted. But he used it an awful lot.
There was another pause. I'm a student, said Ben. Going to be a metallurgist. Somehow, he had managed to finish the whole of his first pint of Shoggoth's Old Peculiar, which was, he realized, pleasantly shot, his first alcoholic beverage. What do you guys do?
We, said Wilf, are alkalites. Oh, great Cthulhu, said Seth proudly.
Yeah, said Ben. And what exactly does that involve?
My shout, said Wilf. Hang on.
Wilf went over to the barmaid and came back with 3 more pints.
Well, he said, what it involves is, technically speaking, not a lot right now. The alkaliting is not really what you might call laborious employment in the middle of its busy season. That is, of course, because of his being asleep. Well, not exactly asleep. More like, if you want to put a finer point on it, dead. In his house at sunken Rylea, dead Cthulhu lies dreaming, interjected Seth. Or, as the poet has it, that is not dead what can eternal life, but in strange aeons, chanted Will. And by strange, he means bloody peculiar. Exactly. We are not talking your normal aeons here at all. But in strange aeons, even death can die.
Ben was mildly surprised to find that he seemed to be drinking another full-bodied pint of Shoggoth's Old Peculiar. Somehow the taste of rank goat was less offensive on the second pint. He was also delighted to notice that he was no longer hungry, that his blistered feet had stopped hurting, and that his companions were charming, intelligent men whose name he was having difficulty in keeping apart. He did not have enough experience with alcohol to know that this was one of the symptoms of being on your second pint of Shoggoth's Old Peculiar.
It's all right now, said Seth, or possibly Will. The business is a bit light, mostly consisting of waiting. And praying, said Wilf, if he wasn't Seth. And praying, but pretty soon now, that's all going to change.
Yeah? Asked Ben. How's that?
Well, confided the taller one, any day now, great Cthulhu, currently impermanently deceased, who is our boss, will wake up in his undersea living sort of quarters. And then, said the shorter one, he will stretch and yawn and get dressed. Maybe read the papers. Probably go to the toilet. I wouldn't be at all surprised. And having done that, he will come out of the ocean depths and consume the world utterly.
Ben found this unspeakably funny.
Like a plowman's, he said. Exactly, exactly. Well put, the young American gentleman. Great Cthulhu will gobble the world up like a plowman's lunch, leaving but only the lump of Branston pickle on the side of the plate.
That's the brown stuff? Asked Ben. They assured him that it was, and he went up to the bar and brought them back another 3 pints of Shoggoth's Old Peculiar.
No.
He could not remember much of the conversation that followed. He remembered finishing his pint and his new friends inviting him on a walking tour of the village, pointing out the various sights to him.
That's where we rent our videos. And that big building next door is the nameless temple of unspeakable gods, and on Saturday mornings there's a jumble sale in the crypt.
He explained to them his theory of the walking tour book and told them, emotionally, that Innsmouth was both scenic and charming. He told them that they were the best friends he had ever had, and that Innsmouth was delightful. The moon was nearly full, and in the pale moonlight both of his new friends did look remarkably like huge frogs, or possibly camels. The three of them walked to the end of the rusted pier, and Seth and/or Wilf pointed out to Ben the ruins of sunken relais in the bay, visible in the moonlight beneath the sea, and Ben was overcome by what he kept explaining was a sudden and unforeseen attack of seasickness, and was violently and unendingly sick over the metal railings into the black sea below. After that, it all got a bit odd. Ben Lassiter awoke on the cold hillside with his head pounding and a bad taste in his mouth. His head was resting on his backpack. There was rocky moorland on each side of him, and no sign of a road, and no sign of any village, scenic, charming, delightful, or even picturesque. He stumbled and limped almost a mile to the nearest road and walked along it until he reached a petrol station. They told him that there was no village anywhere locally named Innsmouth, no village with a pub called the Book of Dead Names. He told them about two men named Wilf and Seth, and a friend of theirs called Strange Ian, who was fast asleep somewhere, if he wasn't dead, under the sea. They told him that they didn't think much of American hippies who wandered about the countryside taking drugs, and that he'd probably feel better after a nice cup of tea and a tuna and cucumber sandwich, but that if he was dead set on wandering the country taking drugs, young Ernie, who worked the afternoon shift, would be all too happy to sell him a nice little bag of homegrown cannabis if he could come back after lunch. Ben pulled out his A Walking Tour of the British Coastline book and tried to find Innsmouth in it to prove to them that he had not dreamed it, but he was unable to locate the page it had been on, if ever it had been there at all. Most of one page, however, had been ripped out, roughly about halfway through the book. And then Ben telephoned a taxi, which took him to Bootle Railway Station, where he caught a train, which took him to Manchester, where he got on an airplane, which took him to Chicago, where he changed planes and flew to Dallas, where he got on another plane going north, and he rented a car and went home. He found the knowledge that he was over 600 miles away from the ocean very comforting, although later in life he moved to Nebraska to increase the distance from the sea. There were things he had seen, or thought he had seen, beneath the old pier that night that he would never be able to get out of his head. There were things that lurked beneath gray raincoats that man was not meant to know. Squamous. He did not need to look it up. He knew. They were squamous. A couple of weeks after his return home, Ben posted his annotated copy of A Walking Tour of the British Coastline to the author, care of her publisher, with an extensive letter containing a number of helpful suggestions for future editions. He also asked the author if she would send him a copy of the page that had been ripped from his guidebook, to set his mind at rest, but he was secretly relieved as the days turned into months, and the months turned into years, and then into decades, that she never replied.